There wasn't a corner of the planet untouched by protests this year. From tear-gas streets of Ferguson, Missouri to the streets of Jadavpur University in West Bengal. While some protests were remarkably peaceful, like the Occupy Hong Kong, which was galvanized by public anger, others turned violent, like the Kiss of Love campaign in Delhi, Hyderabad and Chennai. Not every protest was effective. Hong Kongers still don't have democratic rights, Jadavpur University protests are still ongoing, and those in Ferguson are still awaiting justice. The wave of social action that ended 2014 is unlikely to crest in 2015. And social media will perhaps play a bigger role in galvanizing anger against injustice. What follows are some of the most powerful footage of protests from the global streets in 2014. Earlier in 2014, anti-government protests in Thailand blocked key intersection in the heart of Bangkok in an attempt to bring the government to a standstill and force the Prime Minister to quit. Protest leaders who call themselves the People's Democratic Reform Committee wanted the government to hand over power to an unelected People's Council. Almost 200,000 protesters joined hands in what is being called one of the largest protests that Thailand has ever seen. On September 16th, peaceful demonstration by students led to police brutality. The students were demanding an investigation into an alleged case of molestation of a female student. The police action triggered a wave of protests by students and teachers. Criticism of the police brutality included that the police used baton charge on a peaceful demonstration and that female students were manhandled and molested by male police officers, and that several men not in uniform attacked the students. The police maintained that there were plainclothesmen among their ranks, while the students insist that these were Trinamool Congress cadres. The incident sparked solidarity protests from various student unions across the country. Thousands of people around the world protested against Israeli military action in Gaza. Thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters took to the streets of numerous European cities, including London and Paris, to demand an immediate end to the conflict. The largest one in Europe drew 11,000 people to the streets of Vienna, who marched across the city centre to the official residence of the country's president. Between 8 July and 27 August, more than 2,100 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip, which includes almost 1,500 civilians, of whom 495 were children and 253 women, according to a UN report. Thousands of people angry over alleged police inaction after a 6-year-old girl was raped at her school in Bangalore rallied to demand that authorities arrest those responsible for the attack. More than 4,000 parents and relatives of children who attended the school in Bangalore shouted slogans against the school's administration and demanded that the police arrest those involved in the July 2nd incident. The rape has raised questions about safety of India's school children and sparked a nationwide outrage over rampant sexual violence against girls and women. The protests put pressure on the police to arrest the suspect and even led to the police commissioner being replaced. Pakistan's Tehreek-e-Insaf chief Imran Khan called for a 1 million-man march to overthrow the ruling government, alleging rigging by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's party during the last elections. Protesters followed Imran Khan from Lahore to Islamabad and marched in unity, hoping to topple the government. Although Imran Khan made all attempts to ignite the nation, the crowd size fell far short of expectations. Several thousand supporters by most estimates, but not the billed 1 million-man march. Scores of pro-Tibet activists staged demonstrations outside the Chinese embassy in Delhi to protest the Chinese President Jinping's visit to India. The Chinese head of state was in the country to discuss a range of issues, both regional and global. However, economic cooperation was highest on the agenda. Meanwhile, an envoy of the Tibetan government in exile had asked the centre to raise the Tibet issue with Jinping during his visit. Several protesters were detained by police as they staged a demonstration outside the Chinese embassy in Delhi. Pro-democracy voices rose to a fever pitch this year in Hong Kong, with protesters laying siege in the heart of the city. In September, after a class boycott campaign, students led by the Hong Kong Federation and Schoolism stormed the Civic Square, triggering a mass crowd to protest outside the central government offices in Admiralty. A few days later, another campaign called Occupy Central with Love and Peace, Civil Disobedience joined the ongoing student protests. As the scenes in Central and Admiralty became more dramatic, the police employed tear gas, pepper spray and batons in their attempt to disperse protesters. Excessive use of violence and dispersion of demonstrators by Hong Kong police antagonized and frustrated general public feelings. This, however, did not deter the crowds, as thousands more began to occupy other major thoroughfares of Hong Kong, mainly Mong Kong and Causeway Bay. 2 months later, as the public lost interest in the protest and Beijing issued warnings about strict action, the riot police cleared the protest sites, even as protesters claimed they would be back. A non-violent protest against the moral policing which began in Kerala quickly spread to other parts of the country. The movement began when a Facebook page called Kiss of Love asked youths across Kerala to participate in a protest against moral policing on November 2, 2014. The page received widespread support with more than 143,000 likes on Facebook. After the initial protests in Kochi, similar protests were organized in other major parts of the country in cities such as Hyderabad and Chennai. The campaign received strong opposition from various religious and political groups like the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, Shiv Sena and the Bajrang Dal. As the grand jury came to a decision for not indicting police officer Darren Wilson in the shooting of black teenager Michael Brown, the town of Ferguson erupted in massive protests. The protesters in Ferguson see the case as a symbol of racism and police brutality. Most of the town's residents are black, and most of its police officers are white. The first round of protests after the shooting in August was focused in Ferguson. The second round of protests, in reaction to the jury's decision, spread across America, finding a broader resonance with people who believe racism is still pervasive in the American police system, with many believing that the police uses One view of history would be that 2014 was a year of protest, when ordinary people demanded change, demanded justice and demanded that their voices be heard. But like they say, history repeats itself. Here is a look at some events which changed the world, one protest at a time. Thailand's struggle to keep a People's Party at the heart of the government has been a long-standing one. In 2014, the people protested against the military regime's control of the country. In 2010 too, a prolonged series of political protests occurred in Bangkok, from March to May against the Democrat Party-led government. Organized by the National United Front Democracy Against Dictatorship, also known as Red Shirts, the UDD called for the Prime Minister to dissolve Parliament and hold elections earlier than the end of term, scheduled in 2012. The protest escalated into prolonged violent confrontation between the protesters and the military, and attempts to negotiate a ceasefire failed. More than 80 civilians and 6 soldiers were killed, and more than 2,100 injured by the time the military successfully cracked down on the protesters in May. On 16 September 2014, a peaceful demonstration by students of Jadavpur University led to police brutality. The students were beaten up and women manhandled. The police action triggered a wave of protests by students and teachers, which was supported by several student unions around the country. West Bengal is well versed with police brutality. A few years ago, the farmers were protesting land acquisition in Nandigram. Land was being given to a chemical factory and the people staying in the proposed land were forced to evacuate by the government. As 3,000 policemen descended onto the village, the resultant mayhem led to 14 people being killed. Gaza has long been a bone of contention for the Palestinians and the Israelis. As Israel opened fire against the Palestinians in Gaza, the international community rose together in a protest. Several hundreds of casualties were children. That there were rallies all around the world for peace and restraint was a repeat of the 2008 war against Gaza. Then too, hundreds and thousands of people protested around the world demanding peace. From the streets of Tokyo to those in Chicago, common citizens of the world gathered together, uniting in the hour of need. The Gaza conflict lasted for 3 weeks and ended in a unilateral ceasefire. But not before 1,600 people were killed, 50,800 families displaced, and over 4,000 homes destroyed in the war. The outpouring of grief and anger on the streets of Bangalore in response to the brutal rape of a 6-year-old was unprecedented occurrence. Much like the protests which erupted in the heart of Delhi 2 years ago, as the case of a brutal rape of a young woman came to light. The youth of the country stormed the nation's capital demanding an answer to the lack of security, the lack of accountability, and the inaction on part of the authorities. What the nation witnessed in the week post a brutal gang rape in Delhi was something India had never witnessed before. Peaceful protests became violent as the police came down heavily against the protesters. The public outcry forced the government to take action and enact stricter laws, even as the young woman succumbed to her injuries. Pakistan's Tehreek-e-Insaf chief Imran Khan called for a million-man march to overthrow the ruling government, alleging rigging by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's party, PMLN. Pakistan is no stranger to protests or demonstrations seeking the ouster of the government. In 2007, a lawyers' movement galvanized tremendous support across the country. The movement was against the then President Pervez Musharraf's unconstitutional use of authority and subverting the independence of the judiciary. As the protests grew in numbers and spread across, General Musharraf had to eventually give up his position as the nation's premier and eventually go in exile. As the Chinese premier came to India to strengthen ties, several pro-Tibet protesters came out in big numbers to express their concerns with the Chinese occupation of Tibet. In 2008, similar protests erupted around the world against the human rights violation in Tibet. Supporters gathered in big numbers around the world to demand autonomy and freedom for Tibetans. Pro-democracy voices rose to a fever pitch this year in Hong Kong, with protesters laying siege in the heart of the city. Led by a students' movement to have a democratic form of government in Hong Kong, The protests lasted several months, with ordinary citizens turning up in huge numbers across the city centre. But China is no stranger to student protests. On June 4, 1989, more than 1 million people assembled in Tiananmen Square demanding government accountability, freedom of press, freedom of speech and the restoration of workers' control over industry. Although the government took a conciliatory stance in the beginning, it took to force to disperse the protesters. Hundreds and thousands were killed in gunfire. The Chinese government was widely condemned internationally for the use of force against the protesters. Western governments imposed economic sanctions and arms embargoes. Kiss of Love, a non-violent protest against the moral policing which began in Kerala, quickly spread to other parts of the country. The social media-driven campaign resonated across the country with young and old alike. That this campaign turned so many heads was possible because of the precedents set by the Pink Chatti campaign earlier. The movement, launched by a consortium of pub-going loose and forward women in February 2009, was in response to notable incidents of violent conservative and right-wing activism against perceived violations of Indian culture when a group of women were attacked in a pub in Mangalore. The campaign was conceived particularly in a protest against a threat by Pramod Mutalik of Sriram Sena. Hundreds of pink chattis were sent to Mutalik in response to his hate speech. There have been very few events in American history which have unified and divided Americans at the same time. The shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the subsequent protests which ignited across the country was something no one could imagine. Quite like the protests which happened around Little Rock 9 in 1957. On the intervention of then-President Eisenhower, 9 black students dared to enter Little Rock High School in Arkansas. As they walked into the school, the town erupted in protests against them. Escorted by armed guards, 9 lone students endured verbal and physical assaults. Yet, they never gave in, giving hope and impetus to the civil rights movement in the United States.